Okay, so everything's looking pretty good. One thing I do know, I just want one more level of kind of depth in this simulation. And if we were doing this for a feature film, we really kind of need to layer up different techniques to really give it some more layers of detail. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add some RBD objects that are kind of spew out of the volcano, and I'm going to add in density in those areas and velocity. And it's going to help break up even further and just give it another kind of level of simulation that's going on. And every kind of level that we add deeper is just going to further the realism and the uniqueness of the simulation. So, all right. And the other thing I want to do is just kind of get the shading parameters a little closer to something that we can view a little bit more detail. So I'm just going to play this forward for a few frames and then dial back the emission a little bit in the viewport or the view of the heat. So if we just kind of view things here, it's pretty white hot, so I'm just going to go to the Pyro tab, go to the multi-field, and under our emission parameters, you see all of our shading parameters are derived from our Pyro solver here, reference temperature. So our actual render parameters will be slightly different, but you know, if you wanted to do this after the fact, we could break these connections and then just kind of dial in. You can see what we're changing here for reference temperature. The overall ambient temperature will change the simulation quite a bit, so maybe 450, and then bring this back to the 1000 that it was. Maybe 900. So we can kind of play around with those to get something a little bit different. Maybe just bring the overall temperature scale down. So that's a little something more, so we can view maybe those details a little bit better. So one last thing I want to consider before we add in that other bit of detail is you can see how we're kind of, since the wind is blowing this all to the right, it kind of looks like we're not really getting much emission on the left side there. So I actually just kind of want to angle the velocity. I want to emit just a little bit to the left to make it appear like we're kind of battling the wind at the moment with the emission. So I just kind of want to push it off to the left so it looks like we're emitting from the entire volcano. Like there's so much in there that it's really coming out from every area. So I'm going to kind of battle that wind by emitting slightly to the left. Don't need to do it from the front since there's this big plume. So I can fade that on. So if we just go back to the first frame, in the fireball source, inner point velocity, I'm going to add velocity. So in frame 1, I'm going to just key the Z at 0, and then I want to add just a little bit of Z strength, say, you know, just after a second, I'm going to key on one frame. I'm going to key on a strength of 1, giving it velocity to the left. So it's going to battle that wind. And that's really subtle, but I know that should take care of that. All right, so now let's go in and add an RBD simulation. So what I want to do is, let's just copy the sphere that we're using here to get the placement. And let's add a separate geometry. Let's call this rocks. Like we're going to be emitting like some rocks that are shooting out. We're just going to add density and stuff off those areas. So all right. So we're going to set up just a basic RBD simulation here. So I'm just going to create a small radius of 1.5 and 1. And I've already had some values that I like where we're going to shoot this out of. And I'm going to make this a polygon. And we're going to give it a frequency of 50. So let's just go ahead and set up a basic RBD simulation. All right, so we've got our sphere here. I'm going to throw down a mountain to make it more kind of rocky. View our mountain. And I'm going to dial in some noise. And I found these parameters from just playing around with our RBD sim that we're going to be simming here. So let's throw down a Voronoi fracture. And this is a classic way to set up RBD sim. Let's scatter points. Scatter points along the rock. And we want to blow up, say, into 100 pieces. And Voronoi fracture that. And automatically, the Voronoi fracture is going to split up the rock based on the scatter into 100 pieces. And to view that, we can throw down an exploded view. And we can just take a look. All right, so here's all our pieces. Great. I just want to use this for sourcing new volume, new emission. I'm not really worried. I'm not going to render these rocks or anything. All right, so let's assemble this together. And we're going to create pack geometry. That's going to set it all up into one nice package. And now let's throw this into a DOP network that we're going to use to actually simulate. So in our DOP net, let's dive in here and let's create a classic RBD sim. I want to create an RBD packed object. That's going to go into a rigid body solver, which is going to go into the output. And we're going to throw down a gravity node. All right, so by default, the RBD packed object, we need to choose what are we going to throw in there. Well, we want to use this first input here. So RBD packed object, in the geometry source, we're going to choose first context geometry. There we go. So we've got our rock and we press play. It's just going to float down to the ground. So we want to blow this out like a bomb. So there's a few ways to do this. What we're going to do to make a bomb is we're going to throw down a magnet force. Okay, so our magnet force, let's make sure it's working. So we're going to do it in negative value. So we're going to blow it outwards. Let's do negative 10,000 to make sure it's going to work. And then we need to tell it kind of where to have the force. So for that, we're going to throw down a SOP geometry. And this is all pretty standard stuff, guys. And if you watch some of my other tutorials, this is a pretty standard setup. And I've used this a lot. That's why it's quite fast. And once you kind of memorize this, you just kind of set this up. It's a no-brainer. So in the SOP geometry, I don't want to use an external SOP geometry. I'm going to select that off. And I'm going to add in a metaball. So if we go into the SOP geometry, let's type in metaball. And this is what the SOP geometry needs to blow out the magnet force. So let's type in a transform so we can move the metaball around. All right, so to view this, see we can't view anything when we go into the SOP geometry. So let's just go back, and in the SOP geometry, let's use object transform. And you can see we got a metaball down there. But to be able to move that, I want to move it up. We're going to have to pin this viewport here so we stay in this viewport. So now we go into the SOP geometry, we're still going to stay in this viewport. So now we can go into our transform and move this up. So I've found, and again, this will be a trial and error, but we just kind of want to move it up and over and into our rock. And let's kind of move it over there. And I want to scale it up a little bit and down in Y. So essentially we're going to be pushing this off from the faces of the geometry. So if this were really big here, there's more face area on the sides. We'd be pushing it out and not up a little bit more. So that's why I want to keep this I want to keep the faces in line with where I'm trying to push it here. So finally, let's create the overall scale quite a bit bigger. And this is just trial and error. At this point, we can just kind of play things along and see how everything's working. So we're pushing out. Really got an explosion going on. If we go in here and kind of, you know, change things off to the left a little bit, then things will blow up a little bit differently. So yeah, I've found these values to be working for me. Could reduce the scale, see how that works. Not quite as strong. So just kind of dial that in. So we're definitely going to need to add in also a collision. So for that, let's throw down a terrain object. So a terrain, obviously we want to be our terrain here. So let's make sure to uncheck the pin view here. Let's merge in the terrain here. All right, so let's find our mountain VDB. Let's go to our SOP path. Go to our, mountain collide. Our SOP path is our VDB, and the object path is the mountain, which is mountain collide. Okay, so let's just plug this into a merge. Let's merge this into our tree here, and it's just calculating the collision initially here. So I want to make sure that we're not going to be calculating too much that we don't need. So let's select use object transform. That'll put it correctly in place. And we're using volume-based collision detection. Okay, so now let's just kind of go back to frame 1, calculate a frame here, see what it gives us for collision geometry. Okay, so it's given us this pretty good representation here. Let's go into our collision guide, and it's actually pretty low resolution because we're just using 30 uniform divisions. Let's boost this up to something that's good enough. So I'm going to use 200 uniform divisions. And you can see now, all right, so we're getting some pretty good result here. And it doesn't need to be perfect because we're just going to need something to collide off initially. I don't think I'm going to play the full simulation until it comes down, but this is good enough. And as far as the physical attributes of this, I'm just going to turn the bounce to 0, and let's give it a bit more friction. So the rocks are going to, it's pretty steep anyways, but let's just give it a bit more friction. And now we can turn off our collision display guide here. All right, let's press play, see what we get. And it's even slow here. I'm going to turn off hide other objects. And there we go. We're getting some collisions, but it's pretty, let's see, let's turn off the display geometry here. And this should be really fast. Well, it's not as quick as we'd like, but it's not slow either. So, all right. So now let's just take a flip book of this, and we'll see you in the next lesson.